Hello. Thank you very much for having me. And yes, this leads on very nicely. So I'm a PhD student at the Roslin Institute, University of Edinburgh, and today I will talk about how we can leverage the available DNA test results and pedigree information that's collected by the Royal Kennel Club, to improve estimates of the mutation frequencies over year of birth in each breed and provide further insights into what has driven these changes over time. So I'm just going to jump in with some relevant background, though I'm sure many of you will be familiar. So most hereditary diseases in dogs are monogenic recessive, and here the disease-causing allele hides in carriers who are free from any clinical signs of diseases, but can unknowingly segregate disease-causing allele to progeny, increasing the frequency in later generations. And other dogs may carry both copies of disease-causing allele, but have yet developed clinical signs. And this is really where DNA testing comes in because it allows us to identify these disease-causing alleles. And this can be used by dog owners to inform breeding decisions and potentially for the provision of personalized treatment where needed. And the results of DNA tests are reported for specific hereditary diseases as either clear, so they have no copies of disease-causing allele, a carrier, so they have one copy of disease-causing allele, or affected, meaning they have two copies of disease-causing allele. And for pedigree dog health, the Royal Kennel Club in the UK records the DNA test results against the dog's individual record within the pedigree information. And this is what allows them to monitor the changes in the disease-causing allele frequencies over years through this population level monitoring. However, the uptake of DNA testing can vary across breeds and specific hereditary diseases, and it's not always widespread. And this is illustrated in green on the graph for the DNA test uptake of primary lens fixation in the miniature bull terrier. And the Royal Kennel Club addresses this through the assignment of hereditary status to progeny where the parents are known to be homozygous, meaning they either are clear, so carry two copies of the normal allele, or affected, so carry two copies of the disease-causing alleles. And as shown on the right, this can occur through three potential matings. So if it's clear by clear, we can assign a hereditary clear to the progeny, clear by affected, hereditary carrier to the progeny, and affected by affected, a hereditary affected to the progeny. And as shown by blue, this fills a significant gap. However, this will consist of predominantly hereditary clears due to this sort of preferential reporting and mating of clear dogs. And hereditary status is limited. So, for example, we cannot assign hereditary status where one parent carries one copy of each allele, as we cannot know whether the parent passes on the normal allele or the disease-causing allele. And additionally, we cannot assign hereditary status where only one parent's genotype is known, as is obvious. And hence, as shown in the orange, we have a proportion of the pedigree where the disease-causing allele is not being tracked. And it's these unknowns that we are wanting to address with this research. So to do this, we can use a statistical technique known as probabilistic pedigree-based inference. And put simply, this uses the available DNA test results with described family relationships in the pedigree to estimate genotype probabilities for every individual in the pedigree, using the laws of Mendelian inheritance. So if we start with the first individual in the top, we can say that this individual is 50% likely to be a carrier and 50% likely to be affected, given the information or the DNA test results from their mate and their progeny. And this lower individual, we can say the same, 50% likely to be a carrier and 50% likely to be affected, as represented through these genotype probabilities, given the information from their parents. So one is a carrier and one is affected. So for this research, there were two sort of big aims. First is to use the genotype probabilities to estimate the changes in the allele frequencies over time with the aim of improving population monitoring of these disease-causing alleles. And second is to partition the allele frequencies to provide insights into historic genetic processes that have driven the estimated trends we observed in the disease-causing allele frequencies over time. So for this, I won't present results for sort of selected breeds, but I've conducted this analysis for two recessive genetic conditions of the eye across 5 pedigrees. So we have primary lens exation in the Lancashire Gila, Sealyham Terrier, and the miniature bull terrier. And then I have progressive retinal atrophy, rod cone degeneration 4 in the Gordon setter and the Irish setter. And just for a bit of context, primary lens exation is a medium onset disease around 4 years of age, and it describes the displacement of the lens in the eye, frequently requiring emergency surgery to stabilize the lens. And as you can imagine, this is painful and it does result in permanent vision impairment. Progressive retinal atrophy, rod cone degeneration 4 is a late onset disease starting with nighttime blindness and then progressing to irreversible blindness. And across these breeds and conditions, I have a census size that ranges from 6,500 in the Lancashire Gila to around 75,000 in the Irish setter. And importantly, to assess this method of estimating these genotype probabilities, there is also some difference in terms of disease-causing allele frequencies, the affected population sizes, and DNA test uptake as well. So for this, we use all available DNA test results and pedigree information up until the 1st of January 2025. And as previously described, the first step is to estimate these genotype probabilities for the associated genetic condition for every individual in each pedigree. And we use the Python software AlphaPeel with some small modifications. And as illustrated on the right, when we do estimate these genotype probabilities for each individual, these are informed by information from their ancestors, information from their descendants, and their own DNA test results too, if that is present. So after we can estimate the disease-causing allele frequencies directly from these genotype probabilities, which allows us to leverage all of the available data whilst incorporating the uncertainty that exists from Mendelian randomization and the DNA test availability. So this graph presented on the side is comparing the estimate of the disease-causing allele frequency over the year of birth for progressive retinal atrophy, rod cone degeneration 4 in the Irish setter. And we're comparing the estimates when you considering the whole pedigree using the genotype probabilities as shown in orange, to the estimates where we are only considered the proportion of the pedigree with either a DNA test result or a hereditary status in the grey line. So we can see that around DNA test introduction in 2012 for progressive retinal atrophy in the Irish setter, both estimates report a decline in the disease-causing allele frequency, which is good. It's indicating of selection. It's after genetic test introduction where the two approaches differ. So we can see that when we use the genotype probabilities, we estimate a higher disease-causing allele frequency compared to the estimates when we use the available DNA tests and hereditary status only. And this was expected due to the ascertainment bias in DNA testing results and hereditary status from the preferential reporting of cleared dogs. And although present in the genotype probabilities, this is diluted by considering all individuals in the pedigree. And although this graph provides the results only for the Irish setter, this finding is common throughout all 5 of the registered breeds analysed. And thus our results suggest that current methods using DNA test results and hereditary status tends to underestimate the disease-causing allele frequency in the years after DNA test introduction. And by using genotype probabilities, we improve the population estimates of the mutation frequencies through considering the whole pedigree. And as has been really well covered, this is important because we can use these to loosely monitor disease prevalence, to inform guidance and priorities, as well as to evaluate previous strategies as well. So moving on to the second aim, which is to identify genetic processes which have driven historical changes in the disease-causing allele frequencies. And for this, we're applying a technique that's used in livestock to partition the allele frequencies into groups to understand which groups may be contributing more or less to the disease-causing allele frequency. So, for example, we could group by male or female to see whether females or males are contributing more to disseminating the disease-causing allele. So today I will present some key results from 3 different partitionings. So the first partitioning is by sex, so males and females. We then wanted to explore this further, so we also partitioned by individual sires. And then thirdly, we wanted to look more recently, and we partitioned by the presence of DNA test. So this graph shows the partitioning of the primary lens luxation causing allele in the Sealyham Terrier by sex. So we see here that the y-axis is the disease-causing allele frequency, and the x-axis represents the generations. Represents the generations, and I've got an indication of how this aligns with year of birth at the top. And you'll see that we have 4 lines on this graph. So the blue line is representing all the males. The pink line is representing the group for all the females. We have this dashed green line, which is representing the population origin that these sort of pedigree descends from. This is really important for the method, but not so much in interpreting the results. So we're going to ignore this for now. And then this black line represents the overall change observed in the disease-causing allele frequencies. And I've noted it as the sum because if we add the group for the males plus the group for the females and the group for the population origin, it will equate to this black line. So we can see with the Sealyham Terrier that initially we cannot distinguish between whether the females or the males are contributing more to increasing the disease-causing allele frequency. But from sort of generation 12 onwards, we see that the males are contributing very marginally more to disease-causing allele frequency than the females. But from generation 17, we see quite a steep decline in the males, such that from generation 20, we see that the males are contributing more to reducing the disease-causing allele frequency compared to the females. And around generation 17 is likely when the DNA test was introduced. So it indicates that breeders are perhaps selecting more intensely in the sires compared to the dams for this breed. When we look at this in, apologies. When we look at the same grouping in the Irish setter, for example, we see a very different trend. So we see that the males and females have an opposing contribution, with males contributing much more to the disease-causing allele frequency compared to the females. And this initially was suggested perhaps in the Irish setter particularly, they have separate lines in producing dams and sires, but we wanted to explore this a little bit further, and this is when we then decided to separate this male group into individual sires as well. So the next step was to use a separate group for each individual sire. And as before, we have one group for all females in pink, which is going to be exactly the same. The blue line now represents all non-sire males. And these are male dogs that are present in the pedigree but have no recorded offspring. And the cloud of grey is made by many grey lines to represent each of the individual sires. And these are male dogs in the pedigree with at least one recorded progeny. And then in green and gold, I have highlighted two sires due to the relatively high contribution to disease-causing allele frequency. And despite being born early in the pedigree, we can see that their contributions remain high even today. So a quick look into the pedigree found that sire 1 was a show champion, and he had over 200 offspring. So he was a popular sire with equally popular sons and grandsons, and many, including sire 1, was estimated with high certainty to be carrier or affected. And this was likely unknown at the time due to the late onset of this disease. But who was sire 2? He's also a show champion, but not a known popular sire with only 30 offspring, around 30 offspring recorded in the pedigree. So I did a bit more digging and I found that sire 2 was closely related to sire 1. So as described by the simplified pedigree, sire 2 was the great-great-grandsire of sire 1 through both the paternal and the maternal side. And thus, this highlights an example of inbreeding and the use of popular sires, which likely unintentionally increased the frequency of disease-causing allele for progressive retinal atrophy rod cone degeneration 4 in the iris setters. And although the example of inbreeding was only found in the iris setters, the popular sire effect was evident in the Gordon setter and the Lancashire Heeler as well. And as we heard earlier, this is important today because popular sires are still a concern, and I hope by having this demonstrative example, this can be a resource to promote good practices in the future. So on to the final partition and results. We wanted to use this partitioning to understand the contributions from DNA testing. So here we have 3 groups. We have before DNA testing, and then we have DNA tested in green and not DNA tested in sort of red, dark pink. And you can see if we're just focusing on the DNA tested path in green, and you can see after an initial increase due to the necessary sampling bias to identify towards affected dogs to identify the causative mutation, we quite clearly see a decline in the DNA tested group, which aligns with the overall decline we see in the disease-causing allele frequency. So it's highlighting that the use of DNA testing by breeders is very much driving the observed declines we see in these disease-causing allele. Yeah. So this leads me on to the sort of 3 key takeaways from this work. So first, we have improved population monitoring of disease-causing alleles by leveraging all available DNA test results and pedigree information collected and stored by the Royal Kennel Club through the estimation of these genotype probabilities. And second, we have identified historical inbreeding and popular sires, which increased disease-causing allele frequencies. And finally, we confirm that dogs with DNA testing have driven the observed declines around DNA test introduction in the estimated disease-causing alleles. And this confirms results from previous studies through this newly applied partitioning method. So, and with that, I would like to thank you for listening. Thank you to co-authors and everyone who's helped with this project. And yeah, thank you.